Hello everyone and welcome to this week's Media at Sydney talk. This week we have a talk from Dr. James Allen-Robertson, who is a senior lecturer and a computational sociologist at the University of Essex in the UK. His work is focused mostly on the intersection of tech cultures and extremist politics. His book, Digital Culture Industry, published in 2013 by Palgrave, charted the development of digital piracy cultures and systems during the 2000s and their role in the development of legitimate online digital media economies. I will step outside the bio here to say, and it's very, very good, and you should all go and read it. His more recent work has focused on the role of shared discourses between large tech companies and civil liberties groups in their opposition to state surveillance. He currently works closely with the anti-fascist body Hope Not Hate, developing new research methods, and is right now writing a book about the history of extreme politics in tech culture and their contemporary consequences. James has also kindly come on here at 7 a.m. UK time, for which we should all be extremely grateful. James, thank you all so much for coming, and over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, please accept any slowdowns in my brain thinking. There you go. That's a good one. Brain thinking, as more an indication of the time and not of my my competence at the moment. Although I don't know, sometimes they overlap. So yes, thank you very much for inviting me. I presume that we should have enough time for me to work my way through this. I'm going to talk to you today about a project that basically I've been working on for far too long, pre and post pandemic. But which is finally kind of coming to fruition at this point. To give you a little bit of background on me, which Mark kindly did do a little bit of anyway, I've had a long-term interest in the culture of tech. My first kind of major publication was my book that Mark mentioned on digital piracy, kind of the history of digital piracy. But broadly, I'm interested in kind of geek culture, history of Silicon Valley, where tech comes from, quite often how it works as well, and its wider social implications. Around 2015, I started getting into kind of computational social science methods for various reasons. And I've done quite a lot of work in terms of using those techniques for a whole range of different areas. I tend to get kind of collaborations going on where my colleagues come to me and they say, I have this question, but I have no idea how to answer it. And then I deploy computer and data and we see what happens. So as Mark said, that covers kind of things about, I did some text mining of documents submitted to the government regarding the investigatory powers bill in the UK. We've done some network analysis works on the kind of co-occurrence of types of human rights violation with businesses. And done some kind of object detection work and content analysis of images from Twitter and kind of the work that goes on around representing environmental protests. So a whole range of different kind of things. To give you context in terms of this particular project, at the same time as I was kind of working my way into computational social science, I noticed a lot was going on with the tech industry and the right more broadly. I don't think anyone's really been able to ignore the facts that the far right have been kind of growing in, if not in prominence, then in our attention to them. The alt-right, as they call themselves, kind of from the 2010s onwards, characterized by very much kind of their online presence and the kind of the shift in terms of their kind of youthfulness and the affluence of them as compared to kind of stereotypical ideas of the far right that were held in popular culture. And I was also noticing a kind of a more reactionary streaks within tech culture itself at the time as well. I mean, we had the kind of the Gamergate period. There were lots of kind of different kind of intersections between what would have been considered far right politics, I suppose, and tech. And I kind of hasten to add at this point that really I don't think that this was necessarily a new thing. As Mark said, I'm trying to work up a book about the history of tech and far right ideas. But it was kind of in a personal journey, a bit of a revelation to me as I was kind of developing my own awareness of these different kinds of politics and the sheen on kind of the scrappy kind of underdog tech cultures that I've been writing about in my book on digital piracy was starting to flake off. So I was noticing things like kind of Nazi politics amongst online fandoms with the kind of the My Little Pony brony problems, Columbia wrote about the intersection between cryptocurrency and anti-Semitic tropes. There was a lot of kind of questions about kind of plutocratic politics, kind of wealth, and the kind of ideas about the future that were coming out of these people. And there seemed to be a kind of growing kind of form of race science and kind of radical traditionalism emerging amongst software developers as well. Kind of you had the Google memo, I can't remember his name now, about kind of, you know, diversity at Google and the problems of focusing too much on diversity and things like that. Gamergate and growing misogyny and masculinity movements, and also this kind of growing focus, particularly I think in response to discourse around climate change, of kind of tech solutionism, kind of an accelerationist ideas around how to kind of save the world through tech. So all of this was kind of going on, kind of flooding my brain, spending too much time on Twitter and Reddit, as is my way. And I started to kind of wonder why it was that I was seeing a lot of what I call kind of alignment, a lot of commonalities between the tech culture as spaces, which to me, I naively were kind of thinking of as like, well, they're just people that are really into like gadgets and coding and things like that, and more reactionary politics. And I was kind of thinking, why are these ideas entering tech spaces? Is this a radicalisation question? Are they kind of like, you know, is there active movement of trying to recruit these particular cultures? Or is there something about the cultures themselves that makes them amenable to these ideas? Are they in some way picking up on these ideas and kind of running with them themselves because they appeal in some sort of way? And I started to wonder if this was even something that could be demonstrated. And because I had started working my way in kind of computational social science, I was very much in the mindset of, oh, can I turn this into something computational? So that was where I went. And that was, yeah, that was a long time ago. That was probably 2016, 2017. So long journey. And I discovered, or I was discovered for me, was probably more accurate. I was pointed in the direction of probably the most explicit expression of the relationship between reactionary politics and tech culture, which is this kind of area of political thought called neo-reaction, which some of you may have heard of, and maybe what brought you into the room in the first place. For those of you who don't know, it's a kind of an area of political thought that emerged. It has lots and lots of threads and roots, and it's very complicated in terms of its roots. But the way in which we think of the kind of the founding of it is that it came from the kind of the blogosphere period of online culture, kind of around 2007, from someone using a pseudonym Mencius Moldbug on his blog, turned out to be a software engineer in San Francisco called Curtis Yarvin. And it's had some academic attention, not a lot, but some, and it is growing. Tate kind of argues that it's the prefiguring of alt-right politics, that kind of neo-reaction can be seen as the political foundation for the alt-right, a kind of the young, kind of tech-savvy far-right politics of today. And it's this kind of fusion of a traditionalist and anti-institutional kind of conservatism with libertarianism and authoritarianism, which you might think, well, that sounds a bit strange, but yes, libertarianism and authoritarianism. We'll explain how that intersects in a second. But with that, a kind of this futuristic lens of high-tech city-states, digital currency, AI, and this idea of kind of focus on founders, the startup kind of founder as the king of society. At one point, I think Yarvin suggested that someone like Steve Jobs would be the perfect kind of ultimate ruler for society, which make of that what you will. So the basics of neo-reaction and Moldbug's work, and kind of all of the people that work to translate it and things like that, is that democracy doesn't work. And admittedly, at this point where we're having our local elections in the UK and the state of the UK's government at the moment, I can see where this is coming from, but I still don't fully agree with it. But the idea is that democracy doesn't work, that things like political equality, progressive politics, they are all a kind of a false reality, diverting our attention from the real necessities of society, which is essentially human progress through technological development, and kind of allowing the best of the best to do their thing. That there is this kind of cathedral, almost a kind of a conspiracy of the state, the media, universities, hello, conspiracy here, to propagate a false narrative about the way in which society works, and that in fact humans are not equal, that progressivism is making us pretend that they are, and that there are these natural hierarchies, particularly focusing on IQ. They like IQ a lot, intelligent IQ, but they accept kind of race science and gender difference kind of science ideas about IQ and kind of fundamental biological essential differences. And all of this is getting in the way of humanity accelerating towards what they consider its true technological potential, which is kind of hyper-accelerated capitalism with tech. For them, the ideal scenario would be that there is no kind of overarching large state, nation state or government, that there is essentially a free market of these kind of micro-states that kind of a world of Singapores, as it were. That the CEO of every state is completely sovereign, and it doesn't kind of presuppose that there is kind of order in there, that there is no rights to anyone at all, except the right to leave the city-state. So it's kind of a matter of consumer choice. You can enter a city-state, and then you are kind of subject to the rules of the sovereign. And if you really don't like it, then you can just exit and go to a city-state that you do prefer. You can move between city-states, you have kind of consumer choice, and all of this system would be facilitated by cryptocurrency and AI, as all of these kind of technical systems operate, to allow you to just move back and forth between different city-states as you wish. The idea of having kind of a completely sovereign CEO is Moldbug's kind of bringing in of authoritarian. This is a very kind of libertarian kind of secessionist idea of society, but the difference with Neoreaction is this idea of this kind of unimpeachable sovereign. And the idea for Moldbug there is that he doesn't presuppose that order will come from within a completely free libertarian state, that you have to have someone that's kind of holding the sword above your head to make sure that the world operates properly. So he's kind of concerned about security, order, and things like that. It reminds me very much of kind of thinking of how the online world works, in terms of the idea of the online world in that, you know, we are, the politics there is not that people are censored or that people are kind of managed in terms of what they say. The idea is that, well, you just leave and you go and find a group that you prefer. You kind of, you know, whatever forum you prefer to be in. There's this kind of secessionist idea of applying, I don't know, essentially the Reddit model, although Reddit has mods, but they've kind of work. The Reddit model to society. So live in Reddit, essentially, which some of us already do. So the question, I suppose, might be, you know, well, isn't this just this kind of online slight fringe politics? Well, it's a larger thing than that. I think Neoreaction is kind of an expression of an existing kind of common theme, particularly amongst elites, amongst the kind of Silicon Valley investor class, of secession. There's a lot of talk constantly of secession of Silicon Valley from the United States, the building of different kind of microstates, the kind of building of their own cities on the sea. Some of the images I've shown you in the background is from the Seasteading Institute. Seasteading Institute was an institute that was set up by Patrick Friedman, grandson of Milton Friedman. He was a Google engineer before he kind of, and then moved into setting up the Seasteading Institute. Seasteading Institute also funded by Peter Thiel as well. There's a lot of interest in these ideas, and I don't think it's a matter that they're going to be kind of, you know, bobbing along on the sea in their little floating cities anytime soon. But it's the idea of kind of putting this notion of a political system of microstates, city-states, above all else as kind of the forefront. There's a lot of connections to a lot of key Silicon Valley figures out there in Neoreaction, and though they may not be explicit about it, they often express the same kind of ideas. Peter Thiel is a big one in here. Curtis Yarvin, you know, claims a close personal relationship with Peter Thiel. His startup was funded by Peter Thiel. He's worked with his with others of the Thiel Fellows, things like that. There's a lot going on. The way I think of it is seeing kind of Neoreaction more as an archetype for this kind of particular role in society, or this particular person in society, kind of a disdain for contemporary society from a position of privilege, the feeling that you're being held back by the larger social order in some way, that your potential is being limited by regulations, by not funding you enough, by not allowing you to focus on what you want to do, as well as this kind of contrarian politics that kind of says, well, you know, I'm far more intelligent than all of you. I can clearly see the way forward, and you're just messing around with, you know, all of these progressive politics problems, and we just need to focus on tech and the private sector to solve these things. It's a very kind of complex area, and I have not gone into anywhere near as many of the strands as one could do. I've got Balaji Srinivasan, sorry, I can't say that, book up on there, because I had a read of it recently, and it expresses many of the ideas of neo-reaction just without necessarily saying it. The focus on woke culture and wokeness in there is quite profound, whilst he's talking about setting up a system again of kind of networked states. Balaji is one of the key members of key VC fund, Andreessen Horowitz, I think, possibly Andreessen Horowitz, key figure, key venture capital figure in Silicon Valley. So we have this kind of question of what is going on with all of these different connections of the far right and tech culture. And what I was finding is that there were kind of quite a lot of journalistic articles out there, small journalistic pieces, articles indicating kind of connectivity. There were a little bit of academic articles, but what I was really struggling with was that there wasn't really an overall kind of explanation of how these two worlds, tech and the far right, were coming together. There was no kind of map for me, and I like mapping things. I have to have a map. I have to visualize it out. So I kind of had all these stories about the territory, but as shown in the picture, when I started talking about it to people in my department, I started coming across slightly as a crazy conspiracy theorist, because there's so many strands to pull together. And I did start to wonder, am I a crazy conspiracy theorist? So what's the best thing to do if you think you're a crazy conspiracy theorist? Lean into it and do even more research. No, don't do that. So my initial questions were that I was focused less on this overt radicalization question and more on how what could be considered kind of mainstream positions, successful kind of tech kind of company positions, could echo or find commonality with these quite extreme positions. That it was a matter of possibly aligning rather than converging, finding commonality with our own kind of thoughts and the way you see the world, your own frame of the world, with these existing ways of, with these other framings of the world, rather than kind of saying, oh, right, I am now a right-winger, or I'm now joining the alt-right. And I wondered, could we map that process to actually find some sort of structure in what, to me at the time, was a lot of noise? And so this is how I kind of started the mapping aspect of the project. And this is where we get to the more kind of the computational methodological side of things. So I started, where else? With Twitter. And there's good reason for that. And Twitter is, or was, I'm not sure what Twitter is anymore, but at least was at the time. It's a social space without silos. And what I mean by that is that it's not got these kind of spaces where it's not got channels or subreddits or forums or kind of boards that allow people to self-sort. Everyone's kind of in the same space, so everything is visible to everybody. So in my mind, I was thinking to myself, well, Twitter is this kind of space where the extreme can meet the mainstream in some way. At some point, a kind of a clustered community of more extremist politics will find its way somehow to the more mainstream by virtue of the fact that they are eventually connected together. There could be paths traced between them. Now, those paths may be very long or they may be very short. I did not know. So I wanted to focus on Twitter as this kind of space where there was a possibility of the mainstream and the extreme kind of being able to rub up against each other. But I didn't want to focus just on kind of moments of intersection that you often find with a lot of work on Twitter, which is about mapping, like retweet networks, where you gather the tweets around particular hashtags or particular events and then map out who retweeted whom. I wanted to focus actually on attention, where people were paying attention to. And attention in Twitter is essentially your follower networks. Who do you follow? Whose material are you kind of inviting into your feed? At this point, the method I used is probably not financially viable anymore, unless you got a really big grant. So I have a large data set, which I'm wondering if it's incredibly valuable at this point, because I couldn't repeat it right now with the new API changes and charges that Mr. Musk has brought in. But the data I did collect, it was collected in April 2021, so keep that in mind, because the shape of Twitter can change quite a lot, particularly in the last few years. And what I did was I built essentially a custom data collection analysis toolset in Python to try and map this process on Twitter. How is it that ideas move between different groups, and can we map out who those groups are on Twitter when you don't have these kind of silos to direct you in terms of who is meant to be where? So the approach in brief was to create 2 layers of data, and I'm going to cover each layer in more detail in a second, but to give you the overview. First is a follower graph, and the follower graph is essentially a directed network that was built using the follower relations of Twitter users. So it's a kind of, think of it as a network, and every node in the network is a user, and every relation between 2 users indicates a follower relationship, that one is following the other. And the idea of the follower network is it allows us to see the kind of structures or clusters of different groups who kind of all follow one another, identify who maybe the more influential members of those particular clusters might be, and to map the kind of the relationships, the attention relationships between different clusters. And then the other graph that's kind of layered on top and driven by the follower graph is the activity graph. And that asks, what is the content of those communities? What is it that they are talking about? What are the words and phrases and ideas that characterize them? And what kind of content moves between those communities in terms of being retweeted or users being mentioned to kind of open up discourse, channels of discourse and things like that. And the idea is that the follower graph is constructed first, and then we, from the follower graph's insights in terms of the communities we learn about, who represents the communities, and the kind of intra-community structure, kind of the structure between communities, we then gather activity on the basis of that, and then use that activity to see kind of what's going back and forth. So how I built the follower graph, it's a matter of gathering a lot of data and then squishing it, compressing it into something that's more manageable. So we first collected kind of a very large graph of user level relations. So every node is a user and every relationship is a follower relationship between the users. And then that graph is compressed by identifying kind of representative nodes in the graph, and then kind of reconstructing these relationships between those representatives that represent the underlying follower relations between them. And I'll explain how I did this in a second. And then what we do is we use that new kind of much compressed core graph, where we've gone from millions of users to a kind of a core level of hundreds of representative users. And then we kind of find a small number of communities that are expressed by that structure. So the way we did it essentially was we started first with a number of root users, and these are kind of starting users that represent the communities we wanted to map. So we had to manually select 10 different users on the basis of, we used literature review, expert recommendations from people in kind of the far right kind of tracking and activism, anti-far right activism groups and things like that, and as well Twitter's own recommendation system as we were searching for different users, to select 10 people that we thought covered the kind of range of neo-reaction on Twitter. Notably, Yarvin was not on Twitter, and actually quite a few key accounts that were big around neo-reaction back in the early 2010s had already shut down or were kind of completely inactive. But we found others that were still operating in those space, still using the hashtags and things like that. And the first step was to collect all of the IDs of all of the root users' followers. And we're doing this using the Twitter API. So it can be an automated process, and they can provide all the ID numbers of all of the root users' followers. And in the process, we kept track of which root user was responsible for a new user being included, as well as when new users were kind of the result of multiple root users. So we could kind of trace who was having the most influence over the kind of inclusion of users in the graph as well. And this was important for our sampling strategies in the later stages as well, to know why a user was there, who had kind of brought that user into the data set. We then, having collected all of their followers, then selected 200 kind of newly discovered users spread across those different root user domains. So we had to kind of make sure we had an even number of users from every kind of root user area, and chose those 200 to collect their follower ID lists. We did a little bit of chopping off at the top and the bottom in terms of we excluded sampling any users that were in the very top 0.1% of the followers in the data set. So the Twitter API provides the follower number, so the number of followers a user has overall on Twitter. So we basically took the top 0.1% and we excluded them from consideration because they tend to be very, very large accounts operating on existing social capital, like news organizations and things like that, which would skew the data. And we also excluded any users in the bottom 50% of followers compared to all users with the same root, because different areas in Twitter have very kind of drastically different average follower counts. So by adjusting to kind of the average of that area or that kind of the root user area allowed us to ensure that we didn't kind of block out any communities that didn't have a high average follower count compared to some of the other ones. And we did that because there's a lot of low follower accounts on Twitter. Most of the accounts on Twitter are very low follower, very low activity accounts. So you have a lot of noise in there you need to cut out. And then what we did after kind of getting that nice kind of upper range without the very, very top of users, we then selected users with the highest degree. So in networks analysis, degree means the number of connections a node has. And so in our network, this meant the highest number of followers within our data set. So not the highest number of followers on Twitter, but the highest number of followers within our data set. You know, how embedded were they in this world that we were trying to map? We then did that process again. So we ended up with essentially kind of 3 steps from the root. We have the root users, we have 10 root users. Then we added 110,000, maybe 111,000 immediate kind of ego network users, so users that are the followers of those root users. Then we mapped out further to 942,000 users around the kind of the adjacent communities, and then we mapped out 3 million users that were kind of on the distant kind of edge of the network. So in total, we picked up around 4.2 million user IDs and their follower relations, which is about 10 million follower relations. So this was quite big. I mean, it might not be big for some people in the room. This might be small fry, but for me, who was used to mainly qualitative research, this was a large data set. This is the largest data set I've ever worked with. And to analyze this was going to be an interesting question. So because it was so large, I wanted to look at it. I wanted to see it, but mapping that, visually kind of producing that is not necessarily an easy task. And as well, it would have a lot of noise in it. So the next step was to try and find a way to render this graph and compress it to make it more amenable, but to analysis while retaining the underlying structure. And this is where I came upon the work by Stanley and her colleagues, who produced a paper that's published in Nature about graph compression. And the technique behind graph compression that they proposed and that they used, which demonstrated that after compressing a graph and running community detection on it, it matched very, very closely the results of a community detection on a graph of the original data set. So you do community detection on the original data set, and you do community detection on a compressed version of the graph, and the kind of assignments of community matched up for the users that were represented by the compressed graph. So I thought this was a very good route to go down. And the way it works is essentially you identify a small number of the nodes in your network to represent the network as a whole, and you create relationships between them that represent the underlying relationships of the nodes that they are representing. And this hopefully should produce a graph which in a way represents the same community structure as your original, very large, very unwieldy data set. You identify who those representative graphs are going to be by using what's called K-core decomposition. And the way that works is essentially you take your graph and you just trim away, you take users away if they have less than 2 connections. And every time you take a user away, that may reduce someone else's connection. So you just keep trimming until the entire graph has nodes which all have at least 2 relationships in them. At that point, you then identify the node with the most relationships, mark it as being one of your cores, then you remove it, and in doing so, you've now cut a whole load of other relationships in the network, which then means that you need to carry on trimming away those with only 1 relationship. And you repeat and repeat and repeat until you essentially end up with no graph. You've decomposed it, it's gone, and you've identified a set of core users. And then after that stage, we don't do this literally in terms of trimming away. It's a non-destructive process. You then identify for every node in the network. So for all of those 4 million or so nodes, you identify who their closest core node is, and you assign that core node to represent them, to be their kind of representative with the network. And we did that using what's called breadth first search. So essentially starting at the core node, we said, right, who are they, who can they connect to immediately? Then once we gathered all those and as representatives, we then said, right, here's the next one, kind of 2 steps out, who do they connect to, and so forth. And any time that there were users where there was kind of contention, where they could be equally one or another, represented by one or another different core, we just randomly assign them between them. We then built what we call meta relationships on top of those, and those are the relationships between 2 cores that represent their followers underneath. And these had to be weighted quite carefully in order to kind of represent what was going on under the surface of the representative core graph. So the way we weighted them was we created a kind of a score that factored in the frequency of underlying follower relations, so kind of how many follower relations were being represented between 2 cores, the number of users being represented by each core, because every core represented a different number of users, so that might skew it as well. The probability that they would connect to another core is linked in some ways how many users they represent. The number of distinct users involved in those follower relations, because it could be the case that one core was linked to another by 1,000 follower relations because one user represented by that core was a follower of 1,000 different people in another core. So we had to factor in how many of these users are distinct users. And so the idea was that our scoring on those edges, our weighting on those edges, rewarded relationships that involved high frequency, high number of distinct users, and if those number of relations involved a high proportion of all of the users that a core represented. And I think it was a good scoring system in the end. It worked well in terms of the representation. I went through a whole range of different attempts. I started with basic frequency, lots of different attempts to weight it in different ways. And this was the one that didn't skew the data in particular strange ways, or ignore small communities, or kind of over represent large communities and things like that. The result is, because a meta relation can be formed between any 2 cores on the basis of just one user-to-user relation, you get a lot of meta relations which are basically just like a score of like 0.000, a frequency of 1. And so the very vast majority of the meta relations created are very, very low scoring. And what we did was we used a algorithm that finds what's called the kind of the elbow point or the knee point of scores, to find the point where you get a sudden shift in the scale of the scores that indicates that this is significant activity. There is a kind of an underlying relationship going on here, rather than it just being noise. And the result of that was that we basically cut off everything except the top 5% of those meta relations to be the relationships in our graph. So after that, we then ran community detection, standard Louvain community detection, on the compressed version of the graph. And this indicated to us 9 different communities that had at least 3 core nodes involved in them. We had some communities that were 1 node or 2 nodes, but we kind of put the cutoff at least 3 core nodes. Modularity score, if you know what modularity score means, was about 0.675, which is quite a good modularity score, indicating that essentially the clustering that the community detection algorithm did was quite strong. It's not very, the edges are not particularly fuzzy. These are very kind of distinct groups. And the core graph that we presented in the end, after all of that trimming away of users and things like that, represented around 73% of the original graph. So still representing around 3 million users and 8 million underlying relationships. Every node in that graph represents about 13,000 users. It varies, but on average, it's about 13,000. And so we have this kind of compression process that took us from 4.2 million nodes down to 385 nodes. And then after doing community detection, we shrunk that down to about 236. And the relationships shrink as well, down to finally a graph that's 236 nodes and about 3,000 relationships between them. But you might be saying, well, all very well, but who are these groups? And that's where we come to the activity graph. Having got our communities, we then selected the top 100 users from each community, not 100 core, because we still have all the underlying raw graph data underneath that we can draw upon. And we chose the users with the highest number of followers within their own community. So who are the people that are kind of most focused on in the community? Who represents the communities the best? Who has the most attention on them in the communities? And then what we did was we pulled their last 3,200 tweets from the Twitter API. That was a hard limit. The API doesn't provide you any more than 3,200 tweets from someone's timeline, as well as their profile descriptions. And out of a potential 2.8 million tweets that we could have collected from these users, we managed to get around 2 million. So we got a significant amount of tweets to try and represent these different communities. We then used something called CTF-IDF, which is basically a variation of a standard kind of word scoring algorithm in natural language processing called TF-IDF, which I won't go into the details of, but the idea is that it identifies for you what the most significant keywords are within sets of text. And we use that to find top keywords and phrases for each community, drawing on their tweet content and their profile content. We also looked at what the top hashtags were for each community, just based on frequency. And we used all of this kind of keywords and phrases to do kind of a content analysis of those labels of that tweet content to label up each community. And this is what we found. Excuse me. We have, so of our communities, we found the biggest one was the American conservatism one, which is numbered 368. So we have American conservatism, intellectual dark web, cryptocurrency. I'm trying to see the labels because all of your faces are over the labels. I can't read them. Oh, there, I've got them over there. The yellow is the radical Catholics or radical traditionalists. The pink ones, I like that it chose pink for this, was the white supremacists. Then 200 was founders, so that's like startup founders, tech Silicon Valley founders. 112 is kind of the manosphere, but that was a little bit amorphous, the manosphere. It also kind of more like nihilistic philosophy, kind of Nick Landian, Deleuzian kind of philosophical nihilism, I'd say. And then 231, which is kind of like the kind of beigey pale one, is libertarians, which are just under the American conservatism group. And then we had one that we called peripheral, which it had a significant number of cores to it, but the keywords weren't really very clear to us about what they were into. So I'm showing you the keywords for the top ones here for now. So you can kind of get a sense of why we named them in the different ways that we did. The phrases were very useful for us, as well as the keywords, in order of kind of making a determination of who these groups were. I've got the other keywords here as well for some of the other ones. So you've got things like for the founders, for group 200, founder, CEO, build, product, tech, future, co-founder, angel investor, things like that. 112, the manosphere one, was very difficult to kind of classify. I found particularly because most of the profiles were just nothing. which I felt was quite nihilistic in itself. They provided nothing for their profiles, or they provided like a dot or just a picture of, they really didn't show anything at all. But we identified this more on the basis of who the core users were, which I can't divulge to you because of ethical concerns. But we use that as one main way for identifying for that particular community. The rest of it we based on these keywords that were auto-generated from the tweet content and the profiles. So this, to me, I mean, I was quite happy with this, because to me it seemed to reinforce quite a lot of what I had been thinking about neo-reaction, that it was in some way a drawing together of traditionalism, scientism in the IDW, kind of masculinist politics, white supremacy, but also tech, a lot of cryptocurrency stuff, and a little bit of kind of tech founders and things like that with libertarianism and traditionalism. So this, to me, seemed to work. I was quite happy. So I have the map, but what can we actually do with the map is the next kind of question. I liked having the map in the first place, but then I thought, oh, maybe I should do something with the map. And one thing that's very good about this map is that we can leverage it in some way. We've got something in the chat. Can I see what it says? Chat. Someone's saying something. I'll cover that in a second. Mark, time-wise, how long have I got? I presumed I probably have about an hour. Is that right?
Yes, the talk itself we do between 30 and 60. So
okay,
definitely
cool.
have another 15 or so, yeah.
That's all right then. Okay, because what I'd like to talk to you about now is what we've done with the map so far. I have other plans for the map, but we have other ideas. We've done something with the map so far. And this was a collaboration to look at particularly who was playing a bridging role in this particular map. What communities were joining other communities together, perhaps providing this kind of a conduit of information between different communities. And so we move on now to just one example of what we've done with the map so far, which is looking at these kind of discursive bridges, interaction across different communities. And this is work that I've done collaboratively with a couple of other academics, Dr. Joanna Roma, who's a colleague of mine at Essex, and Dr. Judith Crew, who's at Arizona State. And we were looking here at first this question of who is kind of bridging those disparate parts of the network. If you look at the map visually, you've got these three kind of clustered areas. You've got mainstream conservatism right up at the top, which is kind of the American conservatism group predominantly, with a bit of libertarian thrown in there and a little bit of the people that were classified as white supremacists. And keep in mind, every one of these dots is not one person. Every one of these dots represents 10 to 15,000 different people. So I'm not focusing, you can't say, right, who is that dot? Because every dot represents a population of people. But you have the mainstream conservatism at the top. Then you have that kind of white supremacism, kind of manosphere, kind of alt-righty, kind of almost perhaps what you might consider to be the younger end of things down at the bottom left. And then we have this kind of group that kind of seemingly being implicated by association in the other corner, which is the tech founders and kind of cryptocurrency groups over on the right-hand side, which admittedly are not particularly connected at all directly to those other two larger groups, but they are in the network and they are connected in some way. And the way they're connected is through these two communities in the middle. You've got what we classified as the intellectual dark web, although you might classify it more potentially as kind of contrarian scientism, things like Quillette, Jordan Peterson, kind of controversial evolutionary psychologist academics. That's the kind of space we're talking about with that green intellectual dark web group there. And then the yellows, which is kind of very much radical Catholic traditionalists. So we were interested in these bridging groups, kind of what role were they playing? I mean, visually, already looking at the graph, they were positioned as the center point. And there is some work that I quite like from Venturini, published in Big Data and Society, that argues for the validity of making drawing analysis from force-directed visual layouts of networks, which I think is quite useful to keep in mind. but also actually because we were able to compress this graph and make it manageable for kind of standard network analysis techniques, we used a scoring system called betweenness centrality, which basically asks which nodes in the network are the ones that kind of are, if you were going to walk from every node to every other node in the network, who would you pass by the most? And it was the communities within it was the IDW nodes and the radical Catholic nodes that were the kind of center bridges for this process. You know, if you were going to kind of move information from one group to another within this map, it's very likely you were going to go through someone that was classified within one of those communities. And because of the way we sampled their activity, it meant that the activity that was going on were going to be very highly central members of those respective communities. If you remember, we chose to choose people that were had very high connectivity within their communities to choose their activity. So these aren't just kind of fringe people, these are kind of the central people in there. And we were mostly interested as well because it just seemed on the face of it that this was very contradictory. IDW is kind of characterized by its focus on science, objectivity, potentially atheism, whereas radical Catholic is very much about kind of, you know, Catholic doctrine, rejection of contemporary scientific claims and things like that. And we found as well that in terms of their relationships, if you look at the bottom right there, the relationships between, the interacting relationships between the two communities, we found that, for example, intellectual dark web members were retweeted quite significantly by radical Catholics, and that the radical Catholics mentioned members of the intellectual dark web community quite significantly as well. The score that's most important there is on the very far right-hand side, which is the score percentile. So where does the score for their interaction fit within the overall scores for everyone within the data set? And that you can see they're both in the top 10%. Essentially, they're 90-something percentile for each one. So these are kind of, in terms of all of the activity going on, a lot of activity is going back and forth between these particular groups. So we wanted to know why. What was the activity that was going back and forth? And so Joanna and Judith reviewed 5,700 of the tweets that we had collected that was underlying these interaction scores, including tweets that were retweeted within the communities that were of particularly, that were getting a lot of particular community attention, to kind of understand what was it those communities were talking about internally, and then also looking at the tweets that were authored within the IDW community group and being interacted with by the radical Catholics. So what was being picked up outside of the IDW group that was garnering their attention? In terms of characterizing the groups, they are very much kind of religious groups. For the radical Catholic, kind of religious focus on Catholicism, kind of strong focus on, I can't see my own slides now because I've got this thing in my, I can't see. Strong focus on something, I don't know. Mark, your face is in the way, I can't see.
Sorry, James.
Also, it's all right, it's all right, you can't move your own face. I'm in control of it and I don't know how, but it's fine. You may have come across this particularly in the kind of re-emergence of kind of traditional gender roles, traditional living, trad wives. I think there was a BBC documentary recently about trad wives, and kind of a reverting away from kind of feminist ideals to kind of traditionalist, man knows best, woman does what she's told kind of arrangements. And then you also have the intellectual dark web, which I said is very kind of secular focused, very much about kind of heterodox or contrarian thinking, challenging the thinking of kind of what they consider to be dominant progressive ideas, rejection of what they refer to as identity politics, and a strong focus on claims to objectivity in science. So as I said, on the face of it, these two appear very much distinct. Well, my colleagues worked through all of the tweets, and what they found was these kind of common frames between them. What was it that they were focused on, or that they shared in commonality, even if overall they may diverge quite significantly in their overall kind of goals or interests? And one of these frames was a shared disdain for institutional power. This was a common theme of the retweeted material going on. So you had radical Catholics that were retweeting material from the IDW that included skepticism of the church itself, because a lot of these radical Catholics consider the church itself to be kind of tainted by progressive politics. They're not Catholic enough, the church. But also skepticism of liberal democratic states' power and skepticism of scientific authority. Now you might think, why is the intellectual dark web group skeptical of scientific authority? Because their heterodox position makes them kind of question what they consider to be a liberal bias in kind of more authoritative scientific voices, and a kind of more of a focus on perhaps more fringe voices that are challenging what's considered to be an ideology of progressivism. Both of them kind of equate the organized governance of society in this kind of liberal democratic state as a decline of Western civilization, which is a great far-right dog whistle, Western civilization as a phrase. They use it quite significantly. So there's a lot of criticism going back and forth of the liberal state itself. Liberal democracy itself is framed as non-secular. So the intellectual dark web kind of frame liberal democracy not as a kind of a rational set of decision-making, a rational way to run society, but itself as a kind of a religion, a woke religion, as it were. And the radical Catholics pick up on this and kind of agree that it's a religion, and it's also a false religion. There is kind of conviction between the two of this kind of a conspiracy to cover up this fact by the state to kind of present itself as scientific and rational, and that the state itself is a failure of irrational governance because of its focus on the wrong kinds of social groups. And there's absolutely certainly a racial element and a gender element, and basically anyone that's would be considered someone that would be at a disadvantage in society, kind of the questioning of this idea of privilege within society. The intellectual dark web's critique of the state is kind of folded into the radical Catholics' offering of Catholicism as a worthier, true alternative. So the radical Catholics believe the liberal state should be removed and replaced instead by a system that is better addresses the problems we have through totalizing narratives of Catholic doctrine, that it's not following kind of the teachings of God, though it should instead be kind of using Catholic doctrine as a way of running society, that would solve many of the social problems of democracy. The other common frame is biological essentialism, of kind of fundamental gender truths, racial truths, essentialism, that, you know, different races have particular characteristics, different genders have particular characteristics. And it's kind of a framing that's very aligned with what's been referred to as geek masculinity. It's kind of a way of thinking about the world of being kind of hard-nosed, accepting hard truths about the world that might not be, you know, emotionally nice and fluffy, but we have to accept the hard truths that some people are better than others, some people are not very clever, and it's because of their biology and because of their gender and their race and things like that. And being kind of anti-emotional through their own intellectual strength, a kind of a hyper-rationality, valorizing the intellectual, particularly a very specific version of intelligence, above all else. Excuse me. And that this kind of biological essentialism is a fact, a scientific fact, that is not accepted by an ideological and incompetent progressive state. And so they often intersected around tweets arguing for the inherent biological truth of white patriarchal systems, the nuclear family, that there is a decline in, again, Western civilization, air quotes, because of the lack of focus on the kind of male-led white nuclear family model. And that Catholicism would be the only framework of kind of positive moral values. So there's a lot of kind of back and forth here between them in terms of this broader sense of that there are kind of biological truths which we are not living up to, or we are not accepting. And both come at them from different angles, but they intersect at this point. Excuse me. Their idea is that kind of liberal governance is pushing things like critical race theory as what they refer to, one of the tweets referred to it as a non-secular pathology substitute for society. And then actually both share these kind of more long-termist interests in things like Mars colonization, disavowing of climate change, either because there's the argument that it's, it's based on scientific untruths from the IDW, or that it's part of God's plan for the radical Catholics. And we have these kind of truths, these essential truths about society, about our biology, being threatened by liberal governance, and itself being kind of discredited through these Catholic frames of totalizing truth, the Catholic frames that they, as they understand it, would agree with these kind of fundamental social structures that are biologically based. So between the two, we find these kind of, both the secular and the non-secular, finding this alignment on a number of particular points within these broad frames of anti-institutionalism and biological essentialism. And a recent article from Morton kind of backs this up, because Morton argues that the relationship between Catholicism and neoliberalism is quite interesting, because neoliberalism is, or the relationship is that the Catholics are arguing that Lutheran doctrine, as she puts it, is that fallen sinful man could not properly discern the good or the just, that we cannot plan our economies, that we cannot have states intervening in our economies, our society, that fundamentally we should leave it to the kind of emergent behavior of markets. Similarly, the IDW is attacking the state for its irrationality by kind of trying to intervene in what they see as these biological fundamental truths of society, and any kind of regulation or progressive kind of interventions are seen as an inversion, a intervention that is just causing more problems. Both are criticizing the state for being non-secular. The intellectual dark web's criticizing them for being kind of a religion of progressivism. The Catholic, radical Catholics, criticizing the state for being a kind of alternative, a false religion. And both are considering the progressive state to be irrational in its priorities, either irrational because they're evading fundamental biological truths, or they're irrational because they are not following traditional doctrinal truths. So I know I'm almost out of time here, Mark, in fact, probably by about 10 seconds. But if you allow me to finish, there's just a few slides left, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, thank you. So that was one angle on what we could do with the map. There's many other things. One way of thinking about what we found here was that we would argue that there's kind of gradual exposure over time, rather than a matter of conversion to extreme positions, that because you have this kind of attention networks on Twitter going on, that there is a possibility for constant exposure, allowing this kind of alignment of your existing beliefs and norms and principles with other beliefs and norms and principles. And in part, we kind of draw from, we've written this up as a paper, this particular aspect of it. We draw from Frieden's morphological approach to ideology. And Frieden's approach to ideology is essentially that ideologies are not these kind of silos where you kind of, you drop in one and you're kind of excluded from others. But ideologies are assemblages of different political concepts. Some concepts may be more dear and important to you, some may be more peripheral, but they're kind of all connected together, almost like a network, which I quite like about it. And they can kind of shift and change in response to external kind of influence and things like that. But certain political concepts will be more important to you, some will be less. And they may intersect in some ways. So different ideologies may share particular political concepts. And this may allow this kind of alignment of different ideologies and different points where they might intersect on some areas, but disagree on others, but can find commonality enough in order to form alliances, to form kind of systems between political groups that may push forward their shared goals. Excuse me. So you can have these kind of alignments and alliances form within these particular framings, even without those explicit associations, or even necessarily having shared goals at the end, that they just kind of find commonality between them. And that certain features of tech culture, particularly around geek masculinity, which is something I'd really like to dig into more, are very much amenable to anti-institutional narratives, biologically essentialist narratives, focusing on IQ, intelligence, the kind of concerns about the state and regulation and kind of intervention in terms of, stopping people from reaching their kind of biological heights and their potential through tech and things like that. Other routes we'd like to go down in terms of analysis is looking at that kind of geek culture intersection with traditionalist politics, looking at particularly the discourse between the cryptocurrency group and the founder group and other groups. What is it that's going back and forth between them? Because we tracked what root users were responsible for the inclusion of other users in the network, that's a really interesting area to see about kind of what root users are kind of driving the network most. We've done a little bit of it. It's a fairly kind of even spread, but to find out which communities are most associated with which root users and things like that. We also like to have a look at the centrality and the fringe kind of status of the users that relay information. So is it that ideas are moving between these fringes and kind of moving towards the center and they're getting spread out to everyone else? Or is it that ideas kind of travel between centers and then they distribute out to their larger, wider follower groups, and that propagates out to the fringes? Again, I think we could find ways of tracking this in some way with the data we've got. In terms of the technique overall, is it applicable to other domains? Well, I did test this as I was going on because I did think to myself, this is too good to be true. Have I just kind of created a perfect method to give me exactly what I want to see? But we did test it at certain points along the way on other ones. This was one where we did use roots from UK politicians. So our roots were Boris Johnson, Keir Starmer, Dominic Raab, and Angela Rayner, so kind of two from each of the major political parties in the UK, and found a pretty strong kind of division in terms of Labour and Conservative Brexit sides and things like that. I also subjected my colleagues to this as well, where we put my Essex Sociology colleagues. So this was all of the different accounts that from colleagues at Essex Sociology. And we found a kind of a nice spread out of different communities around things like the criminology group, the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy groups, kind of a little cluster of senior managers and kind of official accounts for the university and things like that. So I think the technique itself is sound in terms of its applicability to other areas. Unfortunately, thanks to Mr. Musk, that may be slightly harder to do with Twitter these days. There are also limitations in terms of the temporality of these, and this was something we struggled with quite a lot, is that the follower networks are built up over different time frames as well, and it's very difficult to kind of say that this is a particular time frame because you have no idea when followers were added to people's follower lists and things like that. So this is kind of across a large time frame, and we can't really distinguish when that time frame is. Also, because you were limited to 3,200 tweets for every person, that means that someone that is very active on Twitter, their time frame may be a few days. For other people that were very inactive on Twitter, that time frame may be a few years. And again, it was quite hard to really limit that when we were doing our data collection. It might be worth us looking through the data and kind of looking at the time frames of the different communities and seeing if there's any differences there. But that's not something we've had a chance to do yet. And yes, with the API changes on Twitter recently, it's very difficult to repeat now. I don't think even the very expensive version, well, I can't afford the basic version of the API now, but the amount of data I collected to build this was quite large, and I don't think I would be able to do that now with the Twitter API as it is. So that's a slight limitation in this method. But just to finish off, fear not, I am actually developing, if you are someone that uses Python or programming or anything for this kind of work, I've developed a little package which does this graph compression for you. And it's quite quick. I can compress a graph of a few 100,000 nodes in about 2 minutes or so. So keep watch, because I am building a little tool that will allow graph compression of any kind of network, not just Twitter networks. So if you have any kind of large scale graph data that you need to compress and would like to do that, then I've created a package called Squashy, which is my daughter's idea, good idea. Which I hope to get in fully working order. It works, but I'd like to get some documentation for it available for people soon. So keep an eye on that if you're interested. And that, 6 minutes over time, very sorry, Mark, is the end of my presentation. And there are references if people want them.
Fantastic stuff. Thank you so much, James. Thank you for such a detailed and comprehensive talk. Can we all send a clap emoji or some clapping in camera and so on?
I've seen a few.
Clearly a bunch of people had to run at 5, which is fine, but thank you all to everyone who is still here. And yeah, fascinating stuff. It's one of those research fields which, as these sorts of spaces become, and these sorts of ways of thinking become increasingly important and influential in tech, in big tech, and as more and more of our online lives take place on the platforms and websites which these sorts of people control, basically. I think this is of paramount importance, I must say. So as the host or convener or whatever the hell this is, I have some questions and comments, but I will hand it over to the field first. If you have a question or a comment or a critique or a query, either go on camera and put your hand up, or use the hand thing in the, like, this thing, or post in chat, or whatever it might be. Joyce, over to you first.
Hi, James. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. Of course, the methods themselves are interesting, but I'm more interested in asking about the background that you talk about, this neo-reactionary movement, because you started from the beginning of the blog era. And of course, now we have learned for a long time that there is the rise of the far right in the digital space, but this contrasts sharply with the hopes of the internet to provide an egalitarian space when the internet first came into being. So my question is, how do you think that, or first of all, has there been a change in the internet culture from this pursuit of equality, openness in the digital space to now towards this neo-reactionary advocacy? Or was it because our impression of the early internet was actually incorrect, because we learn a lot of the world through the mass media rather than directly through the people who participate individually? And therefore, as people participate and had their voice through writing blogs and various later means, then we come to know more accurately what the real situation is. What do you think?
I think this is the reason I'm trying to write the book that I want to write, because I think I've become slightly nihilistic about this, but I think it's the latter. And what I think it is that the narrative about Silicon Valley and tech culture, it's kind of, and the emergence of the internet and online communities from kind of countercultural movements in San Francisco in the 1960s and 1970s, and the kind of development of online communities from those kind of hippie countercultural movements. A lot of those narratives came from people within the movements themselves. And I think they had a kind of a very rose-tinted view of what they were building. I think now, even looking back, I'm one of the things I'm working on at the moment is archive work of cryptography groups online from the 1990s. And the kinds of politics that they're expressing there are very similar to this. There's a lot of talk about kind of, problematic types of people. There's a lot of racism. There's a lot of sexism. There is a lot of kind of talk about essentially creating systems of governance that would assassinate politicians by vote. There's all sorts of stuff going on. So I think there is a layer of naivety about the politics of the tech industry as well, that we haven't really paid attention to, because I think, and I was one of them, we were kind of in the 2000s or so in academia, we were kind of pulled into this idea of all of the potential fun and amazingness of the internet, which there is fun and amazingness to the internet. But we were overlooking the fact that a lot of these narratives were coming from quite a narrow range of voices that were already in Silicon Valley, and that have been quite dominant in setting out that story. There's quite a lot now of better histories about Silicon Valley that recognize the role of, the role of military funding, the role of conservative politicians, the role of displacement of different communities. the kind of the overpowering kind of focus on tech and the pollution that it was causing, all of these different areas, which are not narratives we've really thought about with tech, because we were also focused on the shiny creations that were being produced. So in my mind, I don't think there's been a change. I think what we have instead is that these communities have always been there. That perhaps there may have been changes in that the platforms out there have allowed them to become more visible, but I think they've always been there. And then I think a lot of the politics of tech cultures are, I'm not saying that everyone that programs or works in tech is like this, because it's absolutely not the case, but I think the foundations of the tech industry have often been these kind of quite privileged, white, narrow ranges of people that have a lot of kind of elitist views about society that have been translated into the way in which they see what their tech is for and what the future is for. I know a lot of people that work in tech that are absolutely not like that at all, but it's thinking about what the underlying motivations were for a lot of tech culture in the past, I think. Does that in any way answer your question? I never know if I answer questions when I respond.
But would you be able to guesstimate how prevalent what you describe of this neo-reactionary phenomenon is in the tech world?
I think it's a phenomenon that, I mean, I can't give numbers, but I think it's a phenomenon that is, what matters is that it may be prevalent, the actual adherence to, or to very closely to, neo-reactionary anti-democratic politics may not be particularly prevalent within the rank and file engineers, but it's prevalent within the people that have got the money and the influence, because it aligns with their ideas of, you know, an overbearing regulatory state, that they want to found their own. They look at their tech startups and they say, well, why can't society be like this? So it's kind of not a matter of scale. It's a matter of it's not a matter of how big the network is. It's a matter of where they are in the network that is important, I think.
Yeah.
Thanks, James.
Got,
Chris, yes, over to you next. Sorry, I was trying to get my mouse cursor to the unmute button and it was not behaving well. Chris, over to you.
Oh, yeah, thanks very much. Really fascinating and really interesting to see what kind of makes sense intuitively come out through such a method of network graphing. I mean, I guess for me, it sort of resonates, of course, with watching the documentary I Am Elon Musk as one example, and a cousin of mine who expresses these ideas, and also a little bit in the historiography of histories of computing, that even in the 60s and 70s, there were histories of computing that tended to focus on these kind of genius gifted individuals like, you know, von Neumann and so on, who projected a particular version of kind of intelligent exceptionalism. So I can definitely see the roots of this. It's sort of a comment more than a question.
Yeah, I mean, that is one area where, yeah, it's a good point. That is one area that I've found this kind of, you see it within existing contemporary kind of more not far right, but tech groups of kind of, yeah, built-in innate skills and intelligence and kind of, but you're right as well that those stories about the way Silicon Valley was built in tech culture very often, I mean, you know, the fact that Wired magazine always tends to put like a founder's face on the front and things like that, this idea that it's all about, you know, this amazing individual that, you know, they have these built-in qualities that just make them better than everybody else in some way, rather than ever overlooking the innate, you know, the structural privileges of, say, where Bill Gates came from, where Mark Zuckerberg came from, that all of these people come from backgrounds of wealth, of higher educational privilege, you know, that it's those parts of it get overlooked, and it's more about the fact that, you know, oh, they sat down at their kitchen table and coded for, you know, 48 hours straight and, you know, created amazing masterpieces. It's a similar kind of narrative that goes on in this kind of, there's something essentially good about these people. And it's very much, I mean, I ended up on a rabbit hole of objectivism and Ayn Rand at some point, because it's also that idea of, the elite founder, someone that's just fundamentally better and that knows better and should be left to their own devices to make everyone else's lives better, rather than recognizing in any way where these people have come from structurally or what their intentions are and how they're related. Yeah, that's a very good point.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Chris. Any other comments, questions? I have one if no one else has one at the moment. All right, comment it is then. So I've become quite intrigued recently by these groups basically creating their own alternative platforms to the existing ones. And this, of course, I guess kind of began with Truth Social. I mean, never in the history of the earth has a website had a more balmy name, but Truth Social, and then more recently with my own research focused on Twitch and live streaming, has come Kick, which I don't know if you've come across, James. It's Kick. Yeah, it's a new live streaming site, and kind of, if you imagine a Venn diagram of like alt-right, crypto, NFTs, gambling, free speech in that very problematic model of what these people think free speech means. The middle circle of those people is what Kick is for. As like Twitch is known for being incredibly unpoliced, and they feel it's too policed. They feel the fact that like even a handful of racial slurs are blocked, that's too much, unacceptable. And so they've created this kind of regulation-free version of Twitch in essence. And I think this is kind of fascinating in the context of the general increasing polarization of politics in Western democratic states and so on. And I wonder what you think about, will we see more politically aligned challenges to major platforms like Truth Social, to Twitter, Kick, to Twitch, and so on, come into being? And what might that mean for basically all the stuff that you've been talking about here, and for our kind of shared political futures? So no pressure.
Yeah.
That's quite
no
small,
pressure.
Quite a small question, I think. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
I'll just predict the future a second. No, it's a good question, because you have this kind of, in a sense, you have this siloing kind of different groups off into these spaces, like Gab and Parler and things like that. And these alt tech spaces, as a friend of mine refers to them in their book, is kind of this siloing off of political voice. So in terms of the implications of it, I suppose one might argue that, oh, well, great, they can all silo themselves off into these different places, and then you won't have this kind of social contagion going on in more mainstream spaces. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that the platforms exist for different types of speech and social interaction. People are not limited to one platform. They know what they can say on one platform that may be more mainstream, and they know what they can say on other ones. But I think that what you might find is that actually that these are spaces of kind of not radicalization, but kind of intensification of existing ideas. And in a sense that it's, if we think again of ideology as being these kind of, formations of political concepts, that, Gab or Kick or wherever is where you go to feed those aspects of your ideology, to kind of reinforce those parts of it. And then you can end up maybe then back on Twitter or something like that, where you then express those ideas in more in acceptable language, which is what I think kind of fascinates me the most about this, is what kind of gets called dog whistles, but it's not even dog whistles in terms of it's making speech that is understood by some as meaning particularly radical political ideas and just ignored by everyone else. It's making statements that sound reasonable to the kind of the average liberal citizen in the world, kind of framing things in terms of meritocracy, or framing things in terms of fairness, or framing things in terms of, progress and things like that. And I don't think that there is a intentional kind of system going on of like planned radicalisation where they all get together in these kind of alt tech groups and then say, right, where are we going to go? You go hit Twitter, you go hit Reddit, you hit Facebook mum group or whatever, and we'll say these things and come back. I don't think it's coordinated, and my colleagues that work at anti-fascist groups don't think it's coordinated necessarily in that way. There are occasionally those kind of campaigns, but it doesn't work like that. It's that you go into these spaces and you say things that sound reasonable, that kind of push people a little bit closer. I think was it Chris? Yeah, Chris mentioned having a cousin that was like slightly too into these ideas. You know, I know people quite close to me that are nice, good people that consider themselves to be liberal citizens, but sometimes they say things like, you know, oh, you know, we really need to do something about climate change. There's too many people in the world. And that immediately is a kind of a trope that someone on the far right could get onto. And they're like, yeah, there are too many people in the world. Maybe we should get rid of some of them, or maybe we need to reduce population somewhere. And then that kind of spirals a little bit, and it starts reasonable and goes further. So I don't think siloing off these people necessarily does work. And moderation is very difficult, because if you have someone going on Twitter and saying, I believe in a meritocratic society and the best of the best should get what they deserve, there's nothing bannable about it. There's nothing wrong to say that. You know, it's a very difficult space. And this is why I'm quite interested in not just the technical side of the relationships going on, but actually that qualitative side of what is it that they are saying that could be interpreted by two different groups in similar ways and mean different things, and from an outside observer seem perfectly reasonable. That's a key area for me that really matters, I think, because I think radicalisation can happen very slowly to the most reasonable of people, and they don't have to necessarily kind of claim, you know, conversion. That it can just it's the shifting of what is normal and mainstream and acceptable to think that is probably the most dangerous part of it. We're not going to, you know, society is not going to collapse because a group of, you know, 100 or so very angry men on 4chan kind of bring down the world. It's going to, the problems are going to come when your mum is saying the kind of things that would be acceptable to them as well, in just different language. That's the problem.
Yeah. Great. That's yeah, great thoughts, James. I agree with basically everything you said. Yes, great thoughts. Any other comments, questions, critiques? We are now at 5:24, so we have 6 minutes left for any feedback. And I know we have a bunch of students here, so please do feel free to speak up. This is not just for like faculty and so on to chat.
No, students say stuff.
But if not,
I do have one final question.
Dalia, go for it.
Sure.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Really great talk. Thanks so much, James. I'm just wondering if you could just briefly, I suppose, from how much time we have left, just speak about the sort of Twitter algorithm and how it amplifies or sort of moderates the spread of these sort of neo-reactionary ideas beyond communities, and maybe to make it double-barreled, how this might have sort of changed since the Elon Musk takeover.
I didn't want to go too much into Elon Musk because, you know, he's caused me a lot of troubles over the last year with the research. I also teach the Twitter API, and I've literally had to like strip it out of my entire teaching program. It's problematic. So I just have bad feelings about it from a purely practical point of view at this point. But yes, so the algorithm, in all honesty, I do not know how the algorithm works. I do not know if it's something that people do know how it works outside of Twitter. What I do know is that obviously Musk's priority has been to reinstate certain accounts which were banned under the previous Twitter administration. Those accounts which have been reinstated are always kind of reinstated under the statement of free speech. They all seem to follow a particular trend. Quite often, actually, they're a trend of not being, excessively far right accounts, but they're trends of ones that might sit in that more kind of scientific, the scientism, IDW kind of space of, you know, reasonable people saying reasonable things that, there's no reason why they should be banned. We should allow them to have their kind of contrarian views and things like that. I honestly could not tell you whether the algorithm has actually changed, whether it's a matter of shifting behavior. So a lot of people may be leaving Twitter or just abandoning it and leaving dead accounts. So the activity that's going on there may be more skewed to a particular direction because the people that remain are more skewed. I know, for example, certainly that I saw in my timeline before I gave up on it, a whole lot of voices which I did not want to hear at that time. There was a lot more. For some reason, I was seeing Jordan Peterson a lot. I don't follow Jordan Peterson, but he was turning up a lot in my stream. So I don't know how the algorithm works. I think there is a role of what gets prioritized. I think that any algorithmic system that prioritizes activity as being the main thing that then determines whether something should be shown on a feed will inevitably be pushing controversy and controversial ideas. So, Jordan Peterson puts out a tweet, then, rightly or wrongly, a million different people reply to him and tell him he's an idiot. And then that pushes that piece of information in front of a lot of eyes, because Twitter says, hey, look, there's a lot of activity on this. So it's the algorithmic kind of reinforcing is important. I think there's probably been work done broadly on social media algorithms about the role that they play in bringing the fringe to the center, in terms of taking, these fringe ideas and giving them more prominence, ideas that, we would not have necessarily seen prior to these systems. So there is something to be said about it, but I don't think it should be the only thing to be blamed, which I think we went through a period in academia where it was like, it's the algorithm's making everyone far right, the algorithm's radicalizing everyone. I don't think it is, because we know from long decades of media research that you can have a piece of information put in front of you and it's not going to directly influence your views. You are going to interpret it somehow. So there's something there in your existing worldview that will either make you look at it and say, that's a bunch of nonsense, or don't be so stupid, or you're going to look at it and say, that makes sense to me in some sort of, that you're going to integrate it in some way. So I don't think just because the algorithm puts this stuff in front of people, it kind of directly radicalizes them, but it may put stuff in front of people that have pre-existing ways of thinking about the world, pre-existing frames of the world, that then make them think, that sounds about right. I'm going to follow up on this and see what this person also has to say. So it's a mix of the two, if that makes sense.
Great. Thanks so much, James. Appreciate it.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, James. Thanks, Dahlia. As we are now at 5:29, I think that would be pushing it a little for final questions. So again, James, applause, emojis, etc. Again, thank you so much for giving this talk. It's fascinating stuff, and it touches on so many important issues right now around basically everything happening on the internet. So yeah, pretty good. The
whole internet.
Yes. So yeah, thanks so much, and for such an absurd, grotesque time. Thank you all for coming along to this talk as well. Hope to see you next week for next week's Media Sydney talk, and I will end the recording there.